There is a kind of disappearance that does not look like leaving until you realize you are no longer emotionally important to someone who once carried your entire inner world. And by then, it is already finished, because the most dangerous exit is not when someone walks away in anger. It is when they leave so silently that you only understand the loss when their emotional presence stops protecting your chaos. If this is making you reflect on someone differently right now, take a second to subscribe, because these patterns are not just about relationships. They are about how emotional presence is slowly lost long before physical departure ever happens. There is a kind of silence that does not arrive suddenly, but is built slowly through repeated emotional exhaustion, and this is where the empath's withdrawal truly begins. At first, the empath does not notice that anything fundamental is changing because their natural tendency is to understand rather than to reject. They interpret emotional inconsistency as complexity, they interpret neglect as temporary distance, and they interpret hurtful behavior as something that can be repaired with patience. This creates a pattern where they continuously extend emotional space, even when that space is not being respected. What makes this process dangerous for them internally is that every time they choose understanding over self-protection, they slightly increase their own emotional load without reducing the imbalance in the relationship. Over time, the nervous system begins to register this imbalance not as a single event, but as a continuous state of stress that never resolves. The empath still appears engaged on the outside, still responding, still listening, still offering emotional stability, but internally something begins to shift from openness to quiet monitoring. They start observing instead of fully participating because participation requires emotional investment that is no longer being reciprocated at the same level. This observation phase is subtle and often unnoticed by the other person because nothing dramatic happens. There is no confrontation, no sudden distance, only a gradual reduction in emotional spontaneity. The empath begins to conserve energy instinctively, not out of revenge, but out of self-regulation, because the mind cannot indefinitely sustain environments where emotional output is consistently higher than emotional return. What follows is not an explosion but a cooling, where reactions become shorter, explanations become fewer, and emotional depth becomes less accessible. This is the point where the empath is still physically present but psychologically preparing to disconnect. The most important aspect of this transformation is that it is not driven by a single betrayal, but by accumulation, where unresolved moments stack silently until the emotional system decides that continued exposure is no longer safe or meaningful. There is a stage after emotional exhaustion where something even more unsettling begins to form, and it is not anger or sadness, but detachment. This detachment does not appear as a reaction. It appears as a quiet internal decision that has no words attached to it. The empath does not wake up one day and choose to leave. Instead, they slowly stop emotionally reaching towards situations that repeatedly fail to meet them with the same depth. What once felt like connection begins to feel like effort without return, and the mind starts reorganizing how much emotional energy is worth investing. At this point, the empath is still capable of love, but that love is no longer unguarded. It becomes filtered through awareness of patterns that were previously ignored. Every interaction is processed with a subtle comparison between what is given and what is received, not in a calculating way, but in a protective way that forms naturally after repeated imbalance. This is where emotional presence begins to split into two layers, the external layer that still functions socially and the internal layer that begins withdrawing its full participation. What makes this phase so difficult to recognize from the outside is that nothing visibly breaks. The empath does not create conflict, they do not announce dissatisfaction loudly, and they do not force emotional accountability through confrontation. Instead, they begin reducing emotional availability in small, almost invisible increments. Responses become shorter, emotional explanations become less frequent, and the desire to deeply engage in unresolved dynamics begins to fade. This is not because they no longer care, but because caring without reciprocity begins to lose psychological meaning. The mind naturally moves toward equilibrium, and when emotional input is consistently met with inconsistency or neglect, the system adapts by lowering expectation. Over time, this adaptation becomes identity shaping, where the empath starts existing in a state of emotional self-containment. The most important shift here is that they are no longer trying to fix what is unresponsive. Instead, they are quietly learning how to exist without depending on it. When the empath reaches this deeper stage, the shift is no longer about understanding others, but about understanding themselves in relation to emotional pain. This is where internal clarity begins to replace emotional confusion, and what once felt like loyalty starts to feel like self-neglect. The empath does not become cold, but they begin to recognize that their emotional openness has been repeatedly placed in environments that do not hold it with care. This recognition does not come with drama, it comes with exhaustion that finally becomes undeniable. At this level, the empath's mind stops negotiating with patterns that have already proven themselves. There is no longer an attempt to explain away inconsistency or to mentally rebuild intention behind repeated emotional imbalance. Instead, a quiet psychological boundary begins to form. It is not enforced through words or confrontation, but through internal withdrawal of emotional investment. They still function in conversations, still respond when needed, but the depth behind those responses begins to thin out. What changes most significantly here is emotional expectation. The empath no longer waits for things to improve in the same way they once did. Waiting itself starts to feel like participation in a cycle that costs more than it returns. So instead of hoping for change, they begin observing reality as it is, without the emotional distortion of what they wished it would become. This clarity is painful at first because it removes illusion, but it is also stabilizing because it removes confusion. Over time, emotional effort becomes selective. The empath no longer extends themselves automatically into situations that repeatedly drain them. They begin conserving emotional energy not as a strategy, but as a necessity for inner balance. This conservation slowly reshapes how they relate to everyone, not just one person. It is a recalibration of emotional boundaries that happens quietly and steadily. The most profound transformation here is that the empath is no longer trying to maintain connection at the cost of their own inner stability. And this shift marks the beginning of irreversible emotional separation. At this stage, the empath is no longer emotionally reacting to patterns that once triggered deep involvement because something fundamental inside them has changed. The need to explain everything has started to dissolve. Earlier, they would mentally process every inconsistency, searching for meaning, intention, or hidden pain behind behavior. But now that process begins to feel unnecessary, almost draining in itself. The mind starts choosing simplicity over emotional complexity, not because understanding is impossible, but because understanding no longer changes the outcome. This is where emotional distance becomes more structured. It is not a sudden withdrawal, but a steady reduction of internal participation in the relationship. The empath still listens, still responds, still maintains surface-level connection, but the emotional depth that once flowed naturally into interactions begins to stay within them. It is as if a part of their inner world has quietly stepped back, observing rather than merging. What makes this phase particularly powerful is that it is almost invisible to the other person. From the outside, nothing appears dramatically different. The empath is still present, still kind, still functional within the relationship. But internally, the emotional exchange is no longer balanced in the same way. They are no longer emotionally investing in every moment with the same intensity, because their psyche has started prioritizing stability over attachment. This shift is not driven by resentment. It is driven by recognition. Recognition that emotional patterns do not need to be endlessly analyzed if they consistently repeat without change. The empath begins to accept behavior as it is rather than as what it could become. And this acceptance is not soft. It is final in its own quiet way. As this continues, emotional spontaneity fades. The instinct to overextend, over-explain, or over-empathize weakens. What replaces it is a calm internal distance that allows them to remain composed without being deeply affected. This is the stage where separation is no longer a decision in the future, but a process already happening in the present. At this point, the empath enters a state where emotional withdrawal is no longer a reaction to pain, but a form of internal preservation. The energy that once went outward in the form of understanding, patience, and emotional repair begins to turn inward. It is not that they suddenly stop caring, it is that caring no longer translates into continuous self-sacrifice. The emotional system starts prioritizing balance over connection, and this shift is subtle but irreversible. What becomes most noticeable internally is the loss of urgency. Situations that once triggered immediate emotional engagement now feel distant, almost delayed in their impact. The empath still registers what is happening, but the emotional response is no longer automatic or overwhelming. There is a pause between experience and reaction, and in that pause, detachment strengthens itself quietly. This is also the stage where emotional explanations begin to disappear completely. The empath no longer feels the need to translate their inner state into words for others who have repeatedly failed to understand or respond. Communication becomes minimal, not out of punishment, but because expression without reception loses meaning over time. The silence is not emptiness, it is conservation. Internally, they begin to restructure their emotional priorities. Energy that was once spent on maintaining unstable connections is redirected toward inner stability. This does not happen consciously as a decision, but as a psychological adaptation. The mind learns through repetition that certain emotional investments lead to depletion rather than fulfillment, and it adjusts accordingly without needing permission or announcement. The most important aspect of this phase is that the empath is no longer trying to fix, rescue, or emotionally hold together what repeatedly collapses. They begin to recognize that persistence in such dynamics is not strength but erosion. And once this recognition becomes stable, the emotional bond does not break loudly. It simply stops being reinforced until only physical presence remains where emotional connection once lived. At this deeper level, the empath's withdrawal becomes almost indistinguishable from normal interaction, which is what makes it so psychologically powerful. Outwardly, nothing appears disrupted. They still respond when spoken to, they still participate when necessary, and they still maintain a calm, composed presence. But internally, the emotional thread that once connected them to the relationship in a living, responsive way has started to dissolve. What remains is function without fusion. The most significant change here is not visible behavior, but emotional interpretation. The empath no longer assigns deep emotional meaning to repeated patterns that once consumed their attention. Where there was once analysis, there is now recognition without investment. They see what is happening, but they no longer enter it emotionally. This creates a strange kind of clarity where the situation is understood but no longer absorbed. Over time, this leads to a reduction in emotional reactivity. Situations that once created emotional turbulence now pass through them with minimal disturbance. It is not suppression, it is detachment formed through repetition and exhaustion. The nervous system, after prolonged imbalance, learns that deep emotional engagement is no longer safe or necessary, and it recalibrates accordingly. This recalibration affects how they relate not only to one person, but to emotional dynamics in general. The empath begins to recognize patterns faster, respond slower, and invest less instinctively. Emotional availability becomes conditional, not because they have become guarded in a defensive way, but because their internal system now requires evidence of stability before offering depth. At this stage, even attempts to re-engage them emotionally often fail, not because they are resistant, but because the internal space that once responded so deeply is no longer actively open. It has been reorganized into something quieter, more self-contained, and less accessible to external inconsistency. And once this structure stabilizes, the distance it creates is no longer temporary. It becomes the new baseline from which all future connection is measured. At this final stage of internal shift, the empath is no longer moving away in any visible sense because the movement has already completed itself long before anyone notices. What remains is a stable state of emotional independence that no longer fluctuates based on external behavior. The relationship may still exist in form, but the emotional architecture that once sustained it has already been dismantled from within. What is most striking here is the absence of struggle. Earlier stages often contained confusion, emotional effort, or silent negotiation between attachment and self-protection. But now, even that internal conflict has ended. There is no longer a pull toward repairing what repeatedly failed, and there is no longer resistance to letting it remain unresolved. The mind has reached a point where emotional repetition is simply registered, not absorbed. In this condition, the empath begins to experience interactions with a kind of neutral clarity. They are aware but not entangled, present but not internally dependent. The emotional energy that once automatically flowed into connection now remains contained, creating a sense of calm distance that feels almost unshakable. This is not emotional coldness, it is emotional completion within the self, rather than through others. What makes this phase irreversible is that the need for emotional validation from the same source has fully dissolved. The psyche no longer seeks repair from the environment that caused imbalance. Instead, it seeks consistency within itself. This internal shift changes everything because connection without emotional dependency is no longer attachment in the old sense. It is observation without vulnerability. And in this quiet transformation, the most powerful aspect of the empath's exit becomes clear. Nothing dramatic had to happen for everything to end. No final argument, no confrontation, no visible breaking point. Only accumulated awareness reaching a stage where emotional participation was no longer required for survival or meaning. At the final threshold of this transformation, the empath's quiet exit is already complete, long before anyone realizes they have left. What remains is only the afterimage of presence, a version of connection that still exists socially or physically, but no longer exists emotionally in the way it once did. This is what makes it so difficult to recognize in real time. There is no moment where everything collapses at once. Instead, there is a gradual disappearance of emotional availability until only form remains. At this stage, the empath is no longer negotiating between staying and leaving because that negotiation ended earlier in silence. The inner system has already resolved what the conscious mind once struggled with. Emotional investment has been withdrawn not as punishment, but as completion. The relationship no longer holds the same psychological function it once did, and therefore no longer receives the same emotional energy. What becomes most unsettling for others is the realization that the empath is still capable of warmth, still capable of understanding, still capable of depth, but no longer willing to offer those parts without alignment and reciprocity. The emotional generosity that once felt automatic now feels intentionally reserved, not because it was taken away, but because it has been redirected inward. In this state, even attempts to reawaken old emotional dynamics do not produce the same response. The empath no longer re-enters cycles that previously required them to abandon themselves. There is no anger driving this distance, no desire for revenge in the traditional sense. Instead, there is a quiet refusal to return to patterns that demanded emotional imbalance as a condition of connection. This is why the quiet exit feels so brutal in hindsight. Not because it was loud or destructive, but because it was invisible while it was happening. By the time it becomes obvious, the emotional presence that once held everything together has already shifted elsewhere, leaving behind a space that can be understood but no longer re-entered.